Hello everyone, New Games here with another video in the tutorial series of remaking the core version of Getaway Shootout. In the last video, we implemented player finish, as you just saw there. The player can now reach to the finish object, and then the game will then finish when the player enters it. And as you can see, once it finishes, all the other players stop, and this is where we want to pick up today, is to actually now implement the logic of restarting the next round, so we don't just get stuck at this screen right here. We actually go to the next map and continue playing the game. For now, we'll actually just be playing the same map over and over again. We won't actually implement the map changes in this video today, but we'll actually be implementing the player score, which I'll refer as the game state. And all we need to keep track of is the amount of player wins. So in the original game, we keep track of the player wins up at a scoreboard up here. And when the player reaches a set amount of wins, in the original game, this was 3, the game will actually then be over where a player has won, and then they can restart the game and so forth. But if they're not to the max wins, that's when the player goes to the next map and so forth. So in this video today, we'll be implementing just that simple logic of keeping track of the player wins. And we won't actually implement the UI in today's video, but in a future video, we should be talking about UI and maybe implement a little bit of UI in the Getaway Shootout game. So the game state is actually pretty simple, as I was saying. We just want to keep track of the player wins. But in the future, this could be expanded more, keeping track of other things involved with the game. Maybe you have different game modes and so forth. But we'll start simple with a simple game state. And to do this, I'm going to jump to our scripts folder and create a game state class. So I'm going to call it game state and create that Unity script. So this class, all it's going to be focusing on for right now is just the amount of wins each player has and handling the logic of when a player finishes, incrementing the amount of wins, and checking if the game is now over, if they reach the max amount of wins. So this is going to be a pretty simple class, and it should be noted that you can definitely do this just in the original kind of main game manager class that we were working with before. And actually that's what I do in the original Getaway Shootout game, but I think it's going to be much more organized and encapsulated if we do it in a separate class. And actually, I'll remove this right now. This is going to be a data only class, so it does not need to be derived from the mono behavior. We're not going to be instantiating it as a game object. But as I was saying, you could do it in the game manager and just have variables here such as int player scores, something like this, and just have all your variables in the game manager class. But I think it's going to be a lot more nicely organized if we have it as a separate just data class that has all the functions responsible for it in this class. So that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to actually paste in that array that I just typed. And this is going to be the array of, well, I'll name it players, maybe players score, or we'll do just players score, something like this. And this is going to be an array of integers, which is corresponding to each player's amount of wins that they have. And I'm referring to amount of wins as the amount of times that they've reached the finish object at the end of the game. So, as I was saying, this is going to be a data only class, and that means we kind of just will have these variables up top, and then we'll have functions in this class corresponding to changing this and reading this data from the class. The first function I want to do is, I'll create it here, public void, and I'll call it player finish. And we'll pass in a player ID of the player that finished. And I haven't really explained too much about player IDs, really. In the original game, I have players indexed by 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth in the original game. And that's basically the player that you're controlling. You're controlling player 1, player 2. And this is just associated with an array. So each player will refer to them as the index in this player's array, with player 0 being 1, 2, and so forth. So that's what we'll pass into here, just the player ID. And we could do something like this, player score, and then player ID, and increment the player score when they finish. But it actually, in the original Getaway Shootout game, I delay this increment of score. So I don't increase the score right when they enter that finish zone. I actually wait till the whole game, the whole round is over. Then I increase the player's score. So that's what I'll do actually here. And I'll show why actually this is actually needed to wait in a few moments. But all we want to do is when a player finish is to instead just keep track. And a nice way to do that I'll do is a list, like I did in the previous video, of integers. This is just going to be the finished players. And yeah, this is going to be a list of all the IDs of the players that finished. And I'll have to import the correct using there. And all we want to do then, so when a player finishes, is just add them to this list so that we know that the player has finished. The state then can do stuff with this finished players. We can make another function saying, has this player finished, and so forth. But for right now, all we're going to do with finished players is just add them to this list. It's something like that. And now the other function that I'll create just for right now is something like round over. So again, this is when the door has closed or whatever finish object that you're building or working with has finished completely. No other players can finish. So at this point, the round is completely over, and we should now tally up the finished or the player score. And this is actually why I delay adding player score here, because there's one special condition we have to check, and that is if there's multiple players that finish at the same time, and one of the players is one away from finishing game over. So if I jump here and I'll just create a constant int call it max score, and I'll set it to 3 since that's the original game. So if the player is one away from the max score, meaning that this round they're going to reach the game over, but there's multiple players that finished, we actually want to not increase this score. And this is what I do in the original game, is you can only win, you can only finish the game if you're the only player that finished that round. Otherwise, yeah, you just stay at the same score and you just have to win the next round to finish the game. So I'll implement that logic here. First, I'll loop through that finished players. So for each int player and finished players, so I'm just doing a for each loop to loop through each finished player. And this is where I'll do that logic of we want to make sure that if the finished players count, if it is 1, so meaning we are the only player that has finished, or if we are some sort of score that is way less than the max score, the game over score, then we can increment our own score. So something like player score, player. If it is less than the max score, and we actually want to do max score -1 since we are checking the case of if we're going to reach the max score when we increment. And if we are less than that, then by all means increment the player score to something like that. And yeah, that's basically all we need to do to increment player score. And yeah, that should work, catching that case of if we have multiple finished players and our player score is 1 away, then we shouldn't increment our player score. Okay, so I'm going to save that class, and I'm going to jump over to the game manager because this is where now I'm going to create a reference to our game state. And I'll do this just at the top here, something like game state and game state. And importantly, we want this variable to persist between scene loads. So every time we reload a scene, we create a new game manager, but we want this game state to be the same. So in this case, we'll make this static. That's how you define it. And basically this will persist for the lifetime of the game manager, basically for the lifetime of the Unity game. This will be the same variable throughout. So that's one way of making data persist between scene loads in Unity. So the next thing that we want to do is actually create this game state. And I remember, so we actually haven't initialized the game state yet. So that actually, I'll do that first, is create a constructor for this class, something like this. And actually, we'll initialize this player array. So something like new int. And we need to know the amount of players that we're keeping track of score. So I'm going to pass in through this constructor here the num players, and that just could be the number of players that we are keeping track of score. And I'll also initialize this list up here. So new or finished players is just a default new list, and that's all we have to initialize for now. So I'm going to save that and jump back to Game Manager. Now we can go into our awake method. So when we first play this game, or every scene load, this will be called. We want to check if this game state is null. So if the game state is null, this is the first time we're playing the game. We haven't set the variable yet. So I'm going to say something like game state equals new game state, and we'll have to pass in the number of players. And conveniently, we have the number of players defined temporarily up top here. And I'll actually create a note here to change the location of the variables in the future, because it would be nice to have like some sort of settings class, or maybe even in the game state class, to keep track of the number of players. That way you can change the number of players in the menu or so forth. And that way, yeah, it's not tied just to this game manager class as a public integer. But for right now, it is fine to have something like that. So at this point, we have created an empty game state. We initialize all the players' scores to 0 by creating a new array. And the final thing is to now just use the game state to call these two functions that we created, player finish and round over. So player finished, we can actually get from this finish class that we created in the last video. We currently have this on player entered action here, or event, that we can listen to. Currently we're not listening to it. And this will tell us when a player has finished. So in the game manager, I'll do something like finish on player entered. And this is when we want to call our own method to know when a player has finished. So I'll do something like on player finished, something like this. And if I go here, so yeah, we have, we'll pass in two variables. It's gonna be a player and a boolean if it's the first time finishing. So I'll do something like that. And I'm just seeing, so these two functions are really similar named, and I actually have it different named here. Not that big of a deal. I have it entered and then on all players finish here. I'm going to change this up just a little bit. I'm going to call this like the round over. And then keep this one the same when a player has finished. And we'll do something like this to reflect that, round over. And then I'll do on player finish like this. These namings could change in the future. We have like this on convention. I don't know if I like that or not, but yeah, the names can easily change in the future. And so at this point, this is going to be called every time a player is finished. And all we want to do now is reference our state object, okay, we call it game state. I'm just going to call it state to be easier to reference. So state, and we'll call that player finish method. And conveniently in our player script, we have the player ID already referenced in that player script. So we can just do get player ID because that's a method that we already created. And that's going to be the player that has finished. So something like that. It's good. And then, well, one thing to note is this is going to be only called on the first time that the player's finished. So we don't have to worry about checking if the player's already finished. This should only be called once per player. So that's good. Now we want to do the next thing in the state, which is doing something here, state, and then we'll call the round over. And we actually don't need to pass anything since we know all the players that have finished, since we've been keeping track of them, and doing something like that. And yeah, all right, yeah, that'd be good for right now. And the last thing now is to finish this comment down here, is doing the logic of wrapping up the game. And we actually haven't implemented this in our game state yet, but we want to know basically if the game is over, meaning one of the players has reached the max score, or if the game isn't over, and then we'll continue to the next map, the next round, and so forth. So I'm going to say, I'm going to create a new function down here, and I'm going to call it maybe like to have it return an int and get maybe winner. could do something like get game over or something like that, but I'm just going to create this method to return an int, and basically this int will return -1 if there's no player that has won yet, or it'll return the player ID if a player has reached that max score. So it's going to be a pretty simple function to implement. I'll do something like for loop, just to loop through each player score, and if player score I, if that equals the max score, then return I. Otherwise, return the -1 index, indicating we have not finished the game yet. So I'm going to save that and hop over to the game manager. And this now allows us to easily check with the game state. If we get winner, and if it is greater than, well, greater or equal to 0, that means we have winner. The game is now over. So I'm going to do this as an if. So if we have a winner, well, we want to wrap up the game. So something like wrap game here. Otherwise, the game is not over, and we want to jump to the next map, to the next level, to continue playing and go forth with the game. So to implement these two functions, game over and round over, I'll call it, I'll create actually two coroutines right here. And the first one I'll do is something like game over loop. And I'm creating these as coroutines because it'll be nice to just have the ability to delay a little bit so we don't end the game right when the player finishes. We'll actually be able to implement yield return new wait for seconds to wait some time before we actually end this game. And I'll do something like just like 2 seconds before we end the game there. And actually we won't do anything here because this is where show game over screen and everything else. Basically this is where we have finished, a player has reached the max score, and we'll start that coroutine up here when we have a player that's won. And actually, well, we don't really need it right now, but I'll say something like winner, and I'll pass in, I guess we don't have a reference to it. We'll just keep it since we don't really need to know right now. And then now, the other case that we want to check, if we're not game over, then we'll do something, another coroutine, and I'll call this one round over loop. And very similar, we want to wait some time just so there's a delay. We could also have some UI, some text appear saying who has won and so forth, like the original game. For right now, we'll keep it simple. And I believe we actually wait 1.5 seconds. So I'll do that the same for the game over. So that's could be the same amount of time that we do in the original game. And then now this is where we want to do a round over. So we want to jump to the next map. And for right now, something like scene manager dot load scene. If we just load, so this could be the Unity's function for loading a scene. If we just load the current scene, which is the game scene, which is the scene that we're working with right now. If we just load again, that'll just reload the map, and we should be able to play the game again. But importantly, this variable up here should stay the same since it's a static variable. And I realized we changed variable here, so I'm just going to update that. And then, importantly, we'll start that coroutine round over loop to something like that. Again, this could be have more effects and stuff like that in the future, but something like this should be fine because the main logic is we want to restart the game after a set amount of time. And I'm going to save this and I'm going to jump over. Well, first thing before I jump over, I'm going to make this max score 2 just for right now because this will be easier to test. And the first thing I want to test is once we reach the finish line, if we do that round over and restart the game. Oh, I just got hit there. Nice. Okay, so one player is finished. But actually 2 players have finished there. I wonder if we actually can see. I should have debugged the amount of players. I know we don't get that information in the debug mode. Probably because it's not serializable. But it seemed like it worked where we have 2 players that finished. I don't know who has finished at this point, so I don't know if the game manager. Let me actually, well, that player's finished. I'm gonna actually jump to and actually debug this a little more so we know what is happening. Because at this point we don't have a UI nicely displaying the score. That'll be done in the future. But for right now, we'll do something like maybe in the game state, doing something here. And then we'll debug.log. Oh, so since well, I'll just do this for right now using Unity Engine. Something like that. Or does it need to be? Okay, well, I guess it needs to have like the namespace since there's 2 debugs in this class. And then we'll just debug.log. The player score or the player index. So player, I'll put the index. Probably I should do some sort of formatting string, but it's fine for right now. And we'll do something like that. Player score.i. I was just doing that because now we'll be able to quickly see the player score. It should be working since it is pretty simple, but just to check, so I quickly just dragged our player. So when player 1 has finished, we now have the score of 1 and everyone else is at 0. That's good. And then now I want to check basically if we finish again, if we maintained our state from the previous round. Oh, I could almost got the 2 players finishing at once. Okay, well, this is good. So it seems like we did not preserve our state since player score was the same. Let me just try putting someone else. Maybe it did preserve our states. Okay, actually it did since we still had players 0, the score of 1, player 3. So it actually is fine that the static variable is staying the same over the scenes. It's more of our logic here. We're doing something wrong here. So something with that should have worked when I finished twice, but it still didn't count it. And the finished players should be 1. Let me just quick debug here. Should be a simple. Maybe for right now, since we're just testing this game over state, it should be pretty easy to check. And again, I have to do the same thing here. Okay, so I'm gonna put our player to the end, and now I'm checking if we reached game over. Okay, so that one actually worked. Incremented to a score of 1. And yeah, we're definitely at the game over state there. Let me check 2 again. I can pause the video. It's definitely some simple bug, but let me just check here. So if the player finishes once. Now if we finish again, before that player finishes. Okay, so, okay. Now, yes, that makes sense. So we're doing something wrong, and I see it now. So our finished players was 2 when we only had 1 finished player. So that reminds me, we're not clearing this list, which we need to every time we have the round over, because we don't want to have this list keep growing with old players from last round that finished. So at round over, I'm going to do something just down here, something like player finished, or what do we call it? Finished players. And just using the clear function on the list to empty out all the elements. So now that should be working great. And at this point, yes, I assume that it works. The only other thing now I want to do before I wrap up this video is maybe just to clean up, well, I'll remove this, but to clean up the finish object class. And because now I was thinking we keep track of the finished player order in this game state. It doesn't really make sense to keep track of it here too. Since this is more of a game state thing, better to keep track in this class. So I'll remove it from this class, and basically I'll remove it here. So basically when we do on players finish, we're just going to be calling a simple action like this. And importantly, remove this. Now we do need to keep something local here. We could check every time basically with the game state to see if the player is finished. But I think it's going to be fine to have some sort of duplicate kind of data. But I will make this maybe into like a hash set, just to make it a little faster for this checking contains for the player that is finished. But it's not needed. It's just a little make it a little faster. And at this point, code should be the exact same. And we just have to change this on the game manager. So round over, we're not going to have the finished players be passed in anymore since it's already in our state variable. Okay, I'll just play one more time as I'm wrapping up this video. But at this point, we should have just a simple score for the players to have every time they finish. And the one thing that we haven't implemented yet, so right there we had 2 players finish. It should, in theory, let's see what happened. That actually might have been an issue maybe with 2 players finishing at once, or someone died. I can check into that after the video. It seems like a bug with the finish, not with the stuff we implemented right now. But quickly, I'm just going to get player 0 to finish to test this. Okay. The player 1 finished in the first round. Now I finished in the second round, and since it's up to 2 wins, now the game is over. This is where we could show a game over screen and have players click to play again or go to the menu and so forth. So the system that we implemented today, keeping track of the player score, seems to be working. But there is another small addition we could do in this game state logic, and that is keeping track of the player order. So when a round finishes, it'd be kind of nice to know how close everyone is to the finish, and then use that kind of information to order the player at the next round start. So the player that was in last place then gets to start first, player in the second, start second, and so forth. And I think that'll be a good thing to do in the next video, to kind of have the same functionality as the original Getaway Shootout game. And then after that, then we'll get to map stuff and worry about that next. So I'll see you in the next video.